Welcome to Live the Dream with yours truly, Marty Kaiser. Buckle up and let's get started.
Happy Friday, everyone. This is Marty Kaiser with our latest Real Estate Tidbits podcast. Hope all is well. Start off with a couple of brief tidbits. The first thing is the Federal Reserve did not change their rate this week. So depending on how you look at it, that could be good news or bad news. Everybody's hoping the rates go down, but at the same time, there was concern the rates might go up because of all the uncertainty and unusual activities that are taking place in our not only economic system, but kind of our political system. I'm a real news and political junkie myself, but I've even tried to remove myself from the news to a large degree just because there's so many things on the news, there's so many rumors, there's so many things that change. A lot of the news is a little bit disconcerting. So for my own peace of mind, I'm not watching the news that I used to watch. But anyway, that's the Federal Reserve. We'll keep a close eye on the interest rates. Of course, with the potential tariff wars and the different budget programs that are being cut and just the way the whole budget process and employment in the federal government's very volatile. I think the Federal Reserve is also taking a wait-and-see attitude. And then there's a lot of things that are going into the court system about what's legal or not legal in reference to people potentially losing their rights from the Constitution. So it's an unusual time. I kind of equate one news day into dog years lately, and I don't mean that facetiously. It's just that the news cycle seems to be never ending. One thing I wanted to share with everybody, and it's kind of interesting to me, and it's kind of typical of the real estate business, is when you have a meeting with a customer and you do what's called a market assessment. I always try to have a thorough market assessment if I'm meeting with a potential seller or if I'm working with a buyer and we're contemplating presenting an offer on a property. I try to share with them not only negotiating strategies, but how I arrive at the true value of the property. And I use that basically by doing 3 or 4 things. What kind of trends does the marketplace have? How are the comparable properties that I'm comparing to the property that the buyer is interested in? Which one has more upgrades or lack thereof? And then, of course, locational value. What neighborhood is it in relative to the properties you're comparing? And then within the neighborhood, does it have an appealing lot? Obviously, a house that is facing no neighbors, for example, it's on water, it's on a conservation lot, whatever the case may be, those have a greater value than a house with a rear neighbor because everybody likes privacy. And then, of course, you have to evaluate the relative value of how pristine is that waterfront lot or how private is that conservation lot. So there's just a lot of variables. So those are the things I try to share with buyers. But the point of this particular exercise is to talk about sellers, because sellers frequently will interview 2, 3, 4 agents before they make a decision on who to trust with their property, because for many folks, the residence that they live in is their greatest financial asset. So they want to not only maximize their return on investment, but probably more importantly, do it in an expeditious fashion, try to do it smoothly, try to have an agent that offers tremendous and ongoing communication without the seller having to reach out to the people, and just to try to minimize the bumps in the process, because selling a property for a lot of people can be very stressful. So I went on an appointment this week, and I was one of 3 agents that were chosen by the sellers to interview with. And the other 2 agents were pretty high-profile agents also. And in fact, one of the agents is one of the top 3 or 4 agents in the area relating to total sales volume. And so it was interesting. The seller shared with me what these agents thought the house was worth. And then they also shared with me the materials that the other agents had brought in. And when you're doing a market assessment for folks, it's really up to the listing agent as to what comparables they utilize and, of course, how they adjust the comparables. Some of the things that to me are crucial and what I found kind of interesting in this exercise, the high-profile agent that I mentioned, who's one of the top 4 or 5 agents in the Central Florida market, I utilized a variety of comparables, but one thing I found that was noteworthy and diluted the accuracy of that particular market analysis were some of the sales that that agent had used were pretty old. They ranged anywhere from like 8 to 11 months old, as opposed to what I did. And I came in with comparables that were 6 months old or newer, but most of my data was sold within the last 120 days. Why am I a stickler for that? Because real estate is a continually changing process. A couple months may be better than other months. You may be on a downward trend, you may be on an upward trend. So recency is always, in my opinion, an important component of the process. One of the reasons I believe why this other agent used older comps was because some of the older comps were higher priced, and that enabled that agent to suggest a higher asking price to these particular sellers, because a lot of times agents want to come in with a high recommendation because every seller wants to hear a high recommendation, because obviously the higher the recommendation, the more potential yield that seller gets. But on the flip side, if the property is overpriced, it frequently is not going to sell. It frequently will take a lot longer to sell. It frequently will take price reductions. And oftentimes, using that methodology, the property will ultimately sell for less than it would have sold for had it been priced accurately to start with. What I thought was particularly insightful about that exercise, and not a surprise to me, is kind of the manipulation of data. By using older sales, you're really manipulating the end result. And the end result is supposed to be the most accurate assessment, not the assessment necessarily that the seller would hear. The other thing I found interesting on this particular comparison was some of the comparables, again, that the other agent used were properties that were much larger. For example, the heated and cooled living area on a few of them was 800 or 900 feet larger than the actual subject property. So that is quite significant. It's typically not what an appraiser would use. And of course, if it's a mortgage transaction, the house has to appraise on or above the selling price to eliminate any potential issues. And it's just too high an amount to adjust, because the way that appraisers adjust properties is they really penalize the subject property when it's compared to certain size homes, because a lot of consumers will use the theory from a mathematics standpoint that, let's say, for example, they own a 2,000-foot house and the house sold for $400,000. So the average consumer is going to say, well, properties in that area sell for $200 a foot, which is true based on the data that I shared with you. But when an appraiser compares properties, again, for example, let's say they're comparing properties to that 2,000-foot home. And let's just say in this illustration, they had a property that was 500 feet larger. Well, they would only adjust for that 500 feet a factor of $40 to $50 a foot. Well, that's obviously far less than the $200 a foot that the consumer would put on it. So that's why when you're comparing properties to a subject property, the larger the disparity of square footage, the less accurate your market assessment is. So the point of me going over this is not only to educate everybody about some of the nuances of accurate assessments, but it puts more importance when you're the potential seller of not only speaking with several agents, seeing who you have a good rapport with, seeing who you think has a better marketing strategy. Obviously, you're going to review the market assessment, as I mentioned. But also, when you review that market assessment, you need to ascertain how realistic and accurate it is, because you need to get past the glitter and look at the hard facts. You know, as I've mentioned in previous podcasts, unfortunately, our society tends to be less factual based and more headlines. You know, when you go on the internet and you read things, a lot of times the headline does not really correlate to the facts, and it paints a very misleading or misrepresentation of that particular situation. And the same thing holds true when you're doing these market assessments, because to me, this is one of the most important aspects of when you're pricing a home, is making sure that the data that you're comparing to yours fulfills all the criteria that I mentioned, so that when you make a decision, you're pricing the home within realistic boundaries. I mean, it wouldn't be uncommon, for example, for one agent to think a house is worth $400,000 and another agent to think it's worth $410,000. You know, that's strictly opinion, because the assessment process is subjective. It's not a scientific process. But if one agent tells you it's worth $450,000 and another agent tells you it's worth $390,000, that's a huge difference. So you have to look at the methodology and ask questions, and then try to remove yourself from saying, well, I want the highest absolute price, but say, is this a realistic strategy? A lot of people nowadays will go on some of the national websites like Zillow, Realtor.com, Trulia, and all those sites have an automated value model for pricing. And sometimes their models are fairly accurate and sometimes they're inaccurate. You have to take those with a grain of salt, because they're kind of broad-based. They cover a somewhat larger geographic area. They're not aware when they're evaluating a property if the properties they're comparing have pools, for example. Does the one that they're comparing against have a pool? Which property has better improvements? Which property has a newer roof? Which property has a premium lot? So you have to take these national website valuations with a grain of salt. They're certainly a starting point to give consumers a framework, but again, don't feel that in all cases they're all that accurate. I feel that there's a lot of national websites, and they all have their pros and cons. Obviously, we get a lot of eyeballs on these national websites. And presently, your three biggest websites in terms of viewers are Homes.com, Zillow.com, Realtor.com, and Redfin.com. Those are the four sites that tend to attract more eyeballs. So these are just some things that I feel strongly that people should take into consideration. The other thing along with that, when you're doing financial evaluation, whether you're a seller or a potential purchaser, is having a pretty close estimate of what your expenses are going to be. If you're a seller, any good agent should be able to give you a very accurate estimate of what your selling expenses would be at a particular sales price. It's a pretty simple formula to do with the major expenses that you incur when you sell a house. When you're a buyer, there's a little bit more variation. So one of the things that I tell all my customers, and I can give buyers a pretty good estimate, but I always like them to have a lender furnish a good faith estimate. Any reputable lender will be glad to give a potential buyer a good faith estimate at no cost. And the reason that good faith estimates can vary a little bit is which lender charges more upfront fees. They all charge upfront fees, and some are more expensive than others. So that's one framework. Another thing is, in a particular neighborhood, they look at the HOA fees when they put together your escrow accounts and also what your monthly payments are going to be. The property taxes from house A to house B could vary. So there's different variables that take place when they're doing that. So it's important to get a good handle on that, because there are a percentage of buyers that are going to need closing cost assistance from a seller. So it's really important that they know, without any assistance, a pretty good estimate of what their prepaid and closing expenses are going to be. And then from that number, they can decide how they want to put forth their offer. And there's a lot of ways to put forward offers, but it's very important that everybody in the transaction have a really good handle on what their potential expenses would be. So those are just a few of my tips for getting prepared so that you make the most informed decision. And obviously, the more professional and prepared the agent is that you're working with, they're going to make this process as easy as they can for you. So that's all about that. I did want to mention I'm putting a new listing on the market. In fact, I just went on the market last night. It's a property that we're going to be doing an open house tomorrow at 12 to 3. It's in the Hunters Creek area. It's in the Mar Vista community. It's a very, very nice 4-bedroom, 3-bath with a optional den or media room or home office. It's over 3,100 living area. It's got a nice pool and deck area. Probably the thing that I like best about it, it's one of the nicest lots in Hunters Creek. It's almost a third of an acre. It's a pristine lakefront, and behind the lake, there's a private wooded conservation area. So you get the best of both worlds. You get privacy and you get pristine views. You'll also see wildlife from time to time. You'll see possibly some deer or egrets or possibly some geese. So even though you're not that far into the country, you do get the benefits of all that too. So it's a very nice property. I think it's going to sell rapidly. Again, we're doing an open house tomorrow, Saturday the 22nd, from 12 to 3. If you'd like to call me in advance for any reason or want to schedule a private appointment, feel free to contact me. This is Marty Kaiser. My phone number is 407-595-9700. And I'll leave off with a little sports update today. The NCAA basketball tournament just started, what they call March Madness, and it's a very popular and exciting event. They just started playing yesterday, and they'll have the balance of their first round matches today. And each time that they have 2 days of tournament play, they cut the size of the field in half until they ultimately end up in the final game with 2, and then they'll have a national champion. As I mentioned before the tournament started, the 3 teams I'm giving my favoritism to are the Florida Gators, the Auburn Tigers, and the Duke Blue Devils. I think ultimately one of the 2 teams that's going to be the champion when everything's said and done is either the Florida Gators or the Duke Blue Devils. I'm not prepared to give a final opinion on those 2 yet, as I want to see if Duke star player Cooper Flagg is back to 100%. But it should be a great tournament, and it always gets a lot of eyeballs. A lot of people love playing the NCAA brackets, where before the tournament started, they go through and predict all the games. And I don't believe in the history of the tournament there's ever been anybody that selected all the games correctly, because not only does that require a lot of luck, but there's a lot of games that are played, so it's very challenging. And they always have some upsets. Like yesterday in the first round, some of the upsets they had were Drake, who's a smaller college team, defeated the Missouri Tigers, who's a big team in the Southeastern Conference. And they also had another game where the Arkansas Razorbacks defeated a favorite that they were playing. So you always get some unexpected results, and they're always quite exciting. Major League Baseball just started on a limited basis. They had a couple games in Japan that were regular season games. And they had the star, who's probably the biggest name in baseball, Shohei Ohtani. These games were in Japan, and that was one of the reasons, because Ohtani's probably not only the most popular athlete in Japan, but one of the most popular athletes in the world. He plays for the Los Angeles Dodgers, and the Dodgers won both games. So that's enough about sports today. I hope everyone's doing well. Enjoy the weekend. Have a great rest of Friday, and this is Marty Kaiser out.